Tamar didn't hesitate this time. When she spoke, it wasn't emotional rambling. It was calculated, controlled, and every word landed exactly where it was meant to. She looked straight ahead and said what she'd been holding in for years, that Towanda's relationship with Michael Jr. wasn't something that happened naturally. It was shaped, pressured, managed from the outside. By Evelyn. The room froze. Tamar explained that Towanda wasn't making free choices the way people believed. Decisions were made around her, not by her. Emotional pressure. Family expectations. Quiet manipulation disguised as guidance. Tamar said Towanda felt boxed in, afraid that saying no would mean being labeled difficult, ungrateful, or disloyal to the family. And then Tamar said the line that changed everything. She didn't feel like she had a real choice. That's when the story stopped being about rumors and started being about power. About how control can look like concern when it comes from the right person. About how silence can be mistaken for agreement when someone feels trapped by expectations. Tamar wasn't accusing. She was clarifying. And once she did, the picture people thought they understood suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Because if Towanda was never fully free to decide, then who was really in control all along? Long before Tamar ever spoke up, the dynamics inside the family had already been shaped by quiet hierarchies and unspoken rules. On the surface, everything looked functional, strong matriarchal guidance, siblings supporting one another, decisions framed as being made for the good of everyone. But underneath that structure was an emotional imbalance that only those living inside it could truly feel. Towanda had always been the one expected to adapt, to accommodate, to keep the peace even when it came at her own expense. Towanda's role in the family wasn't accidental. From a young age, she learned that approval came from being agreeable. When others pushed back, she smoothed things over. When tension rose, she absorbed it. Over time, that pattern became her default. Saying yes felt safer than asking questions. Going along felt easier than standing alone. And in a family where opinions carried weight, resistance felt risky. Evelyn's influence operated in that exact space. She didn't need to give direct orders. She guided outcomes through expectations, reminders of sacrifice, and subtle pressure wrapped in concern. Choices were rarely presented as options. They were framed as responsibilities. Doing what was right for the family became the measuring stick, and anything outside of that felt selfish, even when it wasn't. Tamar saw this long before others did. Unlike Towanda, Tamar had always been more reactive, more expressive, more willing to push back. That made her the difficult one, the dramatic one, the voice that disrupted the image of harmony. But it also gave her a clearer view of how control was exercised quietly, without force, without confrontation. She noticed how Towanda's hesitations were brushed aside, how her discomfort was minimized, how decisions kept moving forward whether Towanda was ready or not. The relationship with Michael Jr. didn't start in a vacuum. It entered a space already shaped by obligation and expectation. To outsiders, it looked like a normal progression, two people brought together through family proximity and encouragement. But encouragement, when constant and directional, can become pressure. Tamar noticed how often Towanda's feelings came second to what others thought was best. How her uncertainty was interpreted as fear instead of instinct. Over time, Towanda began to internalize those expectations. When everyone around you insists something is right, doubting it starts to feel like a personal failure. She questioned herself instead of the situation. She learned to interpret discomfort as something to push through rather than something to listen to. That's how control becomes invisible. It convinces you the choice was yours all along. Tamar's frustration didn't come from a single moment. It built over years of watching Towanda compromise pieces of herself to maintain approval. She saw how boundaries were treated as inconveniences. How saying not yet was met with disappointment. How silence was rewarded while hesitation was corrected. And every time Tamar tried to speak up, she was reminded, directly or indirectly, that her role was to stop stirring things up. This emotional history explains why Tamar's revelation landed so hard. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't impulsive. It was the result of years of watching the same pattern repeat, only this time with consequences that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't rewriting the past. She was naming what had always been there, but never acknowledged. Towanda's emotional state during all of this mattered deeply. She wasn't powerless, but she was conditioned. Conditioned to prioritize harmony. Conditioned to trust authority. Conditioned to doubt her own resistance. That conditioning didn't remove her agency, but it narrowed it. And when agency is narrowed long enough, choice becomes blurred. By the time Tamar decided to speak, she wasn't trying to expose anyone for shock value. She was trying to correct a narrative that painted compliance as consent and guidance as care. She understood that naming the pattern would be uncomfortable. But she also knew that staying silent would mean accepting a version of the story that didn't feel true. This backstory is essential because it shows that what happened wasn't about one relationship or one decision. It was about an environment where pressure was normalized and autonomy quietly eroded. And once that environment was named, the past couldn't be viewed the same way again. The real conflict surfaced the moment Tamar stopped speaking in generalities and started naming patterns. She didn't accuse anyone of a single dramatic act. Instead, she laid out a sequence: how conversations happened, how expectations were set, how momentum was created in ways that made resistance feel pointless. According to Tamar, the issue wasn't one decision. It was how a series of small pushes added up to a direction Towanda didn't feel empowered to change. What made this moment explosive was how Tamar framed it. She said that when Towanda hesitated, the hesitation wasn't treated as information. It was treated as a problem to be solved. Doubt became something to correct. Questions became something to manage. Over time, that environment trained Towanda to move forward even when her instincts said slow down. Tamar stressed that this wasn't about blame. It was about acknowledging how pressure can be normalized when it's wrapped in concern. The room reacted immediately. Some people nodded, recognizing the pattern. Others bristled, insisting that guidance is not the same as control. That pushback only sharpened Tamar's point. She explained that the difference lies in choice, whether no is truly an option, or whether it comes with consequences that make it feel impossible. In this case, she said, the consequences were emotional: disappointment, withdrawal, the unspoken suggestion that the family's unity depended on compliance. Then came the first shocking twist. Tamar revealed that she had raised concerns at the time, quietly, privately, and repeatedly. She hadn't stayed silent because she didn't see the issue. She stayed silent because every attempt to slow things down was met with the same response: trust the process, don't overthink it, this is for the best. Hearing that reframed the entire story. It wasn't that no one warned anyone. It was that warnings were dismissed as disruption. As Tamar continued, she described how momentum became its own force. Once plans were in motion, questioning them felt like sabotage. Towanda, she said, was praised for being easygoing and supportive, labels that rewarded her for not pushing back. The more she complied, the more the system around her reinforced that compliance as maturity. And once a role like that is assigned, stepping out of it feels like betrayal, even when you're betraying yourself by staying in it. The twist deepened when Tamar admitted something personal. She had mistaken her own frustration for jealousy at first. She questioned whether her discomfort came from old sibling dynamics rather than genuine concern. That self-doubt kept her quiet longer than she should have been. But as time passed, the signs didn't fade. They multiplied. And when she finally stopped questioning her instincts, she realized the issue wasn't her reaction. It was the environment that taught Towanda to ignore hers. Opposition grew louder at this point. Some argued that Towanda was an adult capable of making her own decisions. Tamar didn't disagree. Instead, she added a layer that shifted the debate again. Adults can choose and still feel cornered. Autonomy doesn't disappear in one moment. It erodes when options are narrowed over time. When every alternative is framed as disappointing someone you love, choice becomes complicated. The first shocking twist fully landed when Tamar said she wasn't trying to rewrite Towanda's past, she was trying to protect her future. Naming the pattern wasn't about assigning guilt. It was about stopping the cycle from repeating. That intent changed the temperature in the room. This wasn't an exposé for shock value. It was an intervention. And then Tamar said the line that reframed everything. When people say it was her choice, they're not wrong. But they're not telling the whole truth. That sentence split the room. It acknowledged agency while exposing pressure. It made space for complexity without letting anyone hide behind simplicity. The story could no longer be reduced to consent versus control. It became about how environment shape decisions and how responsibility is shared when pressure is normalized. By the end of this phase, the conflict had moved beyond disagreement. It had become a reckoning over definitions, what counts as support, what counts as influence, and where guidance crosses into something else entirely. The narrative people were comfortable with no longer held. And once that comfort disappeared, the next stage was inevitable. Once Tamar named the pattern out loud, the situation didn't calm down, it accelerated. Conversations that had once stayed private spilled into shared spaces. Family members who had previously avoided taking sides suddenly found themselves forced to react, even if their reaction was silence. And silence, in this case, spoke loudly. It signaled discomfort. It signaled fear of saying the wrong thing. And most of all, it signaled that Tamar's words had landed closer to the truth than many were ready to admit. Towanda's response became the emotional center of this escalation. She didn't rush to deny what Tamar said. She didn't rush to confirm it either. Instead, she grew noticeably quieter. That quietness unsettled people far more than a public argument would have. Those closest to her noticed a shift, less certainty, more reflection. She started revisiting moments she had once brushed off, asking herself whether she had truly wanted them or whether she had simply gone along because it felt easier than resisting. As this internal reckoning unfolded, outside voices grew louder. Friends, extended family, and people who had witnessed parts of the dynamic over the years began sharing their interpretations. Some defended Evelyn's intentions, arguing that guidance and protection were always at the center of her actions. Others admitted that the pressure Tamar described wasn't unfamiliar. That mix of defense and acknowledgement created tension that no one could smooth over easily. Then came the second major twist. Tamar revealed that what finally pushed her to speak wasn't just the past. It was seeing the same dynamic beginning to repeat in smaller, subtler ways. She recognized the early signs because she had lived them before. The same language, the same appeals to loyalty, the same framing of hesitation as a problem to fix. Realizing that nothing had actually changed forced her hand. Staying silent no longer felt neutral. It felt complicit. This revelation reframed the entire escalation. Tamar wasn't dredging up old wounds for closure. She was interrupting a cycle. That intent changed how some people viewed her words. What had initially sounded like criticism now felt like warning. And warnings are uncomfortable, especially when they challenge long-standing authority. Evelyn's position grew more complex as the escalation continued. She didn't issue a dramatic denial or a public defense. Instead, she leaned into her role as protector, emphasizing experience and wisdom. But that emphasis only highlighted the central issue Tamar raised. When protection overrides autonomy, even good intentions can cause harm. The more Evelyn defended her guidance, the clearer it became how differently she and Tamar defined care. The second twist deepened when Towanda reportedly expressed, in private, that she had never felt allowed to pause. That admission didn't accuse anyone directly, but it confirmed the emotional reality Tamar had been describing. Feeling unable to pause is not the same as being forced, but it's also not the same as choosing freely. That nuance mattered. It shifted the conversation away from extremes and into uncomfortable middle ground. Tension escalated further as alliances quietly shifted. Some family members began asking different questions, not who's right, but how did we miss this? Others resisted that reframing, fearing it would unravel too much of the past. The more the conversation evolved, the harder it became to retreat to familiar narratives. This phase of escalation wasn't explosive in the traditional sense. There were no shouting matches or dramatic exits. Instead, it was marked by long pauses, unfinished sentences, and conversations that ended without resolution. The emotional weight increased precisely because no one could dismiss the issue as exaggeration anymore. By the end of this stage, everything felt unstable. The story people had told themselves for years no longer fit cleanly. Roles were questioned. Intentions were re-examined. And most importantly, Towanda's voice, long filtered through others, began to take shape in new ways. The second major twist wasn't a confession or an accusation. It was the realization that silence had been mistaken for comfort. And once that realization settled in, there was no going back to how things were before. Once the tension reached that point, the fallout became unavoidable. What had started as a family conversation quietly spilled into the public eye, not through dramatic statements, but through visible changes in behavior. People noticed the distance, the pauses, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when certain names were mentioned. Even without direct explanations, it was clear something had shifted, and once the public senses that shift, speculation fills the gaps. Towanda became the emotional focal point of that fallout. Every appearance, every reaction, every moment of silence was analyzed. People weren't just listening to what she said anymore. They were watching what she didn't say. Her calm demeanor was interpreted in multiple ways, strength to some, suppression to others. That pressure weighed heavily on her. Being watched while trying to process your own truth can feel suffocating, especially when your history has always involved prioritizing harmony over self-expression. Tamar felt the backlash differently. Speaking up brought relief, but it also brought isolation. Some applauded her for naming what others avoided. Others accused her of reopening wounds that should have stayed closed. The familiar label of too much resurfaced, reminding her why she stayed quiet for so long in the first place. Even so, Tamar didn't retreat. She stood by her words, not aggressively but firmly, making it clear she wasn't interested in dramatizing the issue, only in being honest about it. Evelyn faced her own emotional reckoning. While some defended her intentions, others began questioning the impact of her influence. That scrutiny was uncomfortable, especially for someone accustomed to being seen as the anchor. The realization that care and control can coexist challenged how her role was perceived. Even those who believed she acted out of love had to confront the possibility that love, when unchecked, can still cause harm. Within the family, relationships grew strained in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations became careful. Gatherings felt different. People avoided topics not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. There was a collective sense that saying the wrong thing could deepen the divide. That caution created emotional distance, turning once open spaces into guarded ones. Public reaction intensified the emotional strain. Fans debated endlessly, choosing sides or demanding clarity. Some shared personal stories of feeling pressured by family expectations, finding pieces of themselves in Towanda's experience. Others pushed back, arguing that accountability shouldn't erase agency. The conversation grew larger than the family itself, touching on themes of autonomy, loyalty, and the cost of silence. For Towanda, the most difficult part of the fallout wasn't the opinions, it was the reflection. Being forced to revisit past decisions through a new lens can be destabilizing. Moments once dismissed as normal began to feel heavier. Not wrong necessarily, but complicated. And complexity is harder to carry than certainty. It asks you to sit with discomfort instead of resolving it quickly. Tamar watched this unfold with mixed emotions. She didn't want to see her sister hurt, but she also knew that growth often begins with discomfort. Her challenge was holding space without taking control, something she had learned the hard way. This time, she chose to support without directing, to speak without steering. That restraint marked a shift in her own role within the family. The public fallout reached a point where everyone involved realized this wasn't a story that would resolve neatly. There were no villains to defeat or heroes to crown. There were only people confronting the consequences of long-standing dynamics. The noise would eventually fade, but the emotional impact would linger. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. The family could no longer rely on silence to maintain peace. Whatever came next would require acknowledgement, patience, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable truths. Because once emotional patterns are exposed, they don't disappear. They wait until someone decides how to address them. Just when it seemed like everything that could be said had already been said, the final twist emerged, not through confrontation, but through realization. Towanda, after days of listening, reflecting, and sitting with the weight of what Tamar had exposed, began to see her own past differently. Not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity that was impossible to ignore. According to those close to her, Towanda admitted something quietly that changed the entire narrative. She said she didn't remember ever being asked what she wanted, only what she was willing to accept. That distinction landed hard. It wasn't about being ordered or commanded. It was about momentum, about being carried forward by expectations until stopping felt impossible. That realization reframed years of decisions that had once felt neutral or inevitable. The twist deepened when Towanda acknowledged that she had confused endurance with strength. She had believed that pushing through discomfort was maturity, that compromise was growth. But now, looking back, she questioned how much of herself she had set aside just to keep peace. That question alone cracked something open that couldn't be resealed. Evelyn, sensing the shift, attempted to reassert calm, emphasizing unity and intention. But the dynamic had already changed. Good intentions no longer held the same power they once did. Towanda's awakening, quiet but firm, introduced a new variable into the family structure: her voice. Not filtered, not deferred, her own. The cliffhanger arrived when Towanda made a decision that stunned everyone. She chose distance. Not permanently, not dramatically, but intentionally. She stepped back from conversations that felt circular. She declined to immediately resolve things for the sake of comfort. For the first time, she allowed uncertainty to exist without rushing to smooth it over. That pause was unprecedented and powerful. Tamar supported that choice without celebrating it. She knew distance wasn't victory. It was space. Space for Towanda to decide what she wanted without pressure, guidance, or expectation shaping the answer. That restraint marked a turning point, not just in the conflict, but in Tamar's role as well. The story now stood on unstable ground. The old structure, where authority guided, compliance followed, and silence maintained harmony, no longer functioned. Something new was forming, but no one could say what it would look like. Reconciliation was possible. So was permanent change. Both paths required patience, honesty, and discomfort. The final twist wasn't a dramatic reveal. It was a shift in power. And the cliffhanger wasn't whether the family would speak again. It was whether they could accept a future where control no longer defined care. Because once someone realizes they can pause, they can also choose to move in an entirely new direction. This is where the story pauses, but it doesn't end. What Tamar exposed wasn't a single moment or a single decision. It was a pattern. A system built on expectation, silence, and the belief that harmony requires sacrifice. Towanda's response wasn't loud, but it was profound. Choosing distance, choosing reflection, choosing her own pace, that may be the most powerful statement of all. So now, the questions turn to you. Do you believe guidance can cross into control without anyone intending harm? Is silence always consent, or can it be survival? And when someone finally names a pattern that's been normalized for years, is that betrayal or accountability? Where do you stand? Should Tamar have spoken up sooner, even if it meant disrupting peace? Should Evelyn have stepped back and listened differently? And should Towanda prioritize healing herself, even if it changes the family forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This conversation doesn't have easy answers, but it matters. If you've ever felt pressured to choose peace over yourself, this story probably hit close to home. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, because this chapter isn't finished. If Towanda decides to speak fully, or if the family confronts these truths head-on, everything could change again. And trust us,